When you pull out your tray for your evaluators to look at, they look at your tray and they see that everything's nice and crisp, everything's intentional, and really establishing from that first step ideal mise en place. All right, so the first puree we're going to make in our series of purees for competition is a cauliflower puree. It's one of the simplest, and we're going to walk through the steps of mise en place, set up for competition. I think about this in two separate in actually multiple steps, right? The first step is the mise en place before the competition, and based on the rules of the competition, you can really take your mise very, very far. The idea is to minimize the amount of space that you take up in the kitchen and to minimize the amount of unnecessary steps in the kitchen for cooking. The whole idea is to take this batch of product down to exactly what we need. I'm going to put 3 grams of salt in it to start. I may need to adjust it. I'm pretty confident I won't. So then later when I taste it, my tasting is just going to be a confirmation that my seasoning's where it's supposed to be. Right? So now all of a sudden you're starting to create this this anticipation from the evaluators. Now they're starting to get excited about the food. They're anticipating your success. I'm looking forward to tasting their food, or this should be fun to watch this team. They came really, really prepared for this competition. And that's exactly where you want to be. While competing, one of the many things that you need to consider is exactly what you need to compete. What do you need to cook? What do you need in order to cook the product? What do you need to get through each individual step? And I have lists. I have an equipment list, I have a food list. I usually end up with a list for my lists, and then there's usually a list that keeps track of all of my lists for my list. The last thing that you want on competition day is to have something missing. Really, that's what it comes down to. To keep it from slipping, and this is true in every case. You're going to want to make sure that it fits underneath your cutting board, and it's going to be something that keeps your station nice and tight. Have everything in order of how it's going to be needed, right? So we have our vegetables, which are going to be prepped first, and then we have our ingredients as we're going to cook. So we've got our oil, then we've got our salt that'll get mixed into this. We have our stock, we have our cream, and then we're going to move it over into the pan here. This is the Ultratex that we're going to add in at the end, so I'll move that right over to the equipment kit. That way when it gets to that point, I'm going to add that in when we add the ingredients to the blender, so that all gets blended together. I'm going to make sure that I cut my onion first so I can start that cooking while I prep the rest. So we get the onion. I'm just going to slice it since this is going to become a puree. In the containers, you want to make sure that you're using a little spatula to get all the contents out of that. And then all of those containers should be stacked and either reusable or recyclable. That's a big deal, especially in competition right now. Move on to the leek. Now this is going to be puree, so knife cuts aren't necessarily important from an aesthetic standpoint, but you need to make sure that things are cut nice and consistent so that way they cook nice and even. You want to make sure that you don't set your knife handle on your cutting board. That's sanitation points that you'll end up losing. Right, so we use our scraper to get the board nice and clean. When you're using a scraper in competition, you want to make sure that it goes and gets washed in between uses. Right, you really want to only keep on your counter what you're using at the time, right? So I've gone through all of my prep. Take my bay leaf, I'm gonna put it with my cauliflower, and then I'm gonna lose the cutting board. All right, so we've got leeks and onions sweating in the oil. I always add salt during the sweating process because that helps everything that helps draw the moisture out of the product that we're cooking. All right, so as we start to see the onions go translucent, don't really want any color. The leeks are also starting to soften up as well. It's the right time to add the cauliflower and the bay leaf. We're going to add white pepper. Once you can start to smell the aromatics of the cauliflower and the bay leaf, then I add my liquid. I really like to fortify the flavor of cauliflower with the liquid of cauliflower stock. That helps reinforce the flavor profile. And again, here's the Quimic. Also could be heavy cream. All right. Something else really relevant, especially when making purees, when you have all this liquid and you have all the room in the pot, you need something that's going to sit directly on top of the product and prevent a skin from forming and help the ingredients inside to cook a lot faster. It'll actually trap the steam underneath, right? So in order to make a cartouche, there's a little bit of origami involved. So we fold it in half. Fold it in half again, right? And we remember that this is the point where everything, this is the middle of the piece of paper, and we basically fold everything to that point. We're going to line it up with the center. We recognize that it's right to the edge there, right? So we'll cut that off already. Fits right on top. And turn that nice and easy so that it continues to move. Right, see you got some slow and steady bubble in there. I guess it's still a little heavy. Right, we want to make sure that it continues to cook, but we don't want it to go really intense. We do not want it to burn. This will also help keep the sides of the pot nice and clean. That's something that's really a nice key of great cooking. Okay, so always use a ladle to transfer your ingredients, right? I know common practice in restaurants and in operations is to take all the solids out and then save all the liquids till after. And by doing that, you know, it allows you to have a thicker puree. What I encourage you to do is to make sure that your recipe is, you know, dialed in to the point where it should be, and then everything goes into the cup. So there's no thought process involved. There's no extra modification during the competition. Twist it on, make sure it's good. Right. Cup. Set it on the blender, and then we'll start on low. And then, because it's a smoothie cup, we flip it back over. Right, so after this comes off of the blender, right, let it rest for a second, take the top off, right, and then there's our consistency. So pull it out of the container. I'll scrape that in a second. And then consistency wise, it looks exactly where I want it. Check it on a plate. And the whole idea is to be prepared to the point where when you cook this in competition, you have your consistency dialed in. So there's not much trial and error. So you don't have to make any adjustments beyond that. And the seasoning is where it needs to be. So the seasoning is where I want it to be. Consistency is where I want it to be, and that's our end result.